Hi, my name is Nathan Hostetler. I'm going into my third year in neuroscience at Western University. I was supervised by Dr. Jarek Mitchell this summer. We focused on the neural basis of callous-unemotional traits and aggression in youth. So callous-unemotional traits and aggression are used to represent psychopathy in youth because psychopathy is not diagnosed in youth. So first we need to characterize what is a psychopath. So one of the cardinal symptoms of psychopathy is emotional poverty, which is a failure to develop the normal range and intensity of human emotions. And another symptom of psychopathy is a lack of empathy. So compared to normal people, psychopaths lack a sense of concern for the well-being of other people, and they don't feel guilt, shame, or remorse to the same extent that other people do. They still might feel them, but not to the same extent. And this emotional profile of psychopaths drives their socially deviant behaviors, and these behaviors can have really negative impacts on society, which we will now discuss. First of all, psychopaths are more likely to be criminals. When we look at the prevalence of psychopathy in the total population, it's about 1%, but the prevalence in the prison population rises to 25%. But not only are they more likely to be criminals, their criminal nature is also more violent than non-psychopathic criminals. So you can see here that prisoners with a high degree of psychopathic traits are by far the most likely to be violent offenders. Finally, psychopathic criminals reoffend at higher rates after being released from prison. So in one 10-year follow-up, they found that 8 out of every 10 psychopaths will reoffend violently, compared to only 2 out of every 10 non-psychopaths. So we've established that psychopaths are more frequently criminals, they're responsible for a lot of violence, and they're more likely to reoffend. But why should you care? And that's because violence is responsible for 1.5 million deaths annually. And to put this number into perspective, that is 36 times the student population at Western University. So before we move any further, we have to discuss psychopathy as a biological disorder. And what I mean by this is that there's a lot more at play when it comes to developing psychopathy than just someone's social environment. While someone's social environment certainly plays a role in their development of psychopathy, there are certain people whose brains have different underlying biology that renders them more susceptible to developing psychopathy than others. And we can't say when someone is born that they are destined to becoming a psychopath, but we can absolutely say that given the right environmental conditions, there are certain people that are much more susceptible to developing psychopathy than others based on differences in their brain. And there's certain regions within the brain that underlie this biology specifically. And these regions are involved in emotional regulation and empathy. So 3 of these regions are the anterior cingulate cortex, displayed there in yellow, the amygdala, displayed there in red, and the temporal cortex, displayed there in yellow. So now we're going to discuss what our study specifically set out to do. So our objective and hypothesis kind of go hand in hand here. We hypothesized that we could find specific regions within the brain in which structural abnormalities are associated with greater levels of callous-unemotional traits and aggression in youth. And this is an example of basic research. So our goal is to inform future clinical research so that they can determine better treatments and have better outcomes. So this might look like less deaths as a result of violence in the case of psychopathy. We selected youth as our sample because personality is more dynamic in youth, so treatments are suggested to be more effective for psychopathy in that age. So our sample size was 59. But we couldn't just recruit run-of-the-mill youth. We needed to make sure that some of them would have high levels of callous-unemotional traits and aggression. So these 2 behavioral disorders are lumped into something called disruptive behavioral disorders. And they're characterized by a defiance to authority and disobedience and higher levels of aggression. So we knew that if we recruited these 2 groups, then we would get some youth with high levels of callous-unemotional traits. As for ADHD, they may have behavioral disorders, but those would be secondary to their attentional deficits. And then we also have healthy controls, of course, for comparison. So within this sample, we now had to find a way to quantify callous-unemotional traits and aggression. And to do so, we used questionnaires. So the first questionnaire that we administered was the inventory of callous-unemotional traits, which screens for a variety of things like a lack of empathy, a lack of guilt, and emotional poverty. And a high score on this test is associated with larger levels of psychopathic traits, persistent severe aggression, and more future violent offenses. Long story short, these are the youth that resemble psychopaths. We also administered the aggressive behavior rating scale to the youth, which measures aggression. But now we had to find a way to measure the structural abnormalities in the brain. So we're going to touch on that next. So we quantified these neuroanatomical abnormalities using an MRI scanner in Western's Metabolic Mapping Center. And then using the resulting MRI output, we analyzed the gray matter volume, thickness, and surface area in various regions throughout the brain. All right, finally, let's touch on the results of our study. So for the anterior cingulate cortex, which we discussed earlier, we found that left anterior cingulate cortex volume was positively associated with callous-unemotional traits and also with proactive aggression, which is a subtype of aggression characterized by committing violent offenses for your own gain. So it would be like mugging someone for their money. And bilaterally, so on both sides, the anterior cingulate cortex volume was positively associated with callous unemotional traits. So for the temporal cortex, which we touched on earlier, we found that left, right, and bilateral temporal cortex volume was negatively associated with callous unemotional traits. Finally, for the amygdala, we found that left amygdala volume was positively associated with callous unemotional traits. So to conclude, we ended up finding some specific structural correlates of callous unemotional traits and aggression in the youth brains. And in the future, we actually collected way more than just structural data using this sample. So we also have functional data and white matter data, which we still have yet to analyze. So there's a lot more fun to be had.